Hey guys, did you know Jeff Goldblum's on this call?
Does your team need to master AngularJS? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day in-person workshop class for individuals or teams. Bring us to your site or send developers to ours, angularbootcamp.com. This episode is sponsored by Widmo5, a brand new generation of JavaScript controls. A pretty amazing line of HTML5 and JavaScript products for enterprise application development in that Widmo5 leverages ECMAScript 5 and each control ships with AngularJS directives. Check out the faster, lighter, and more mobile Widmo 5. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 32 of the Adventures in Angular podcast. This week on our panel we have Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
John Papa.
Hey everybody from sunny Florida.
Lucas Rubelkey.
Hello from sunny Phoenix, Arizona.
Ward Bell.
From frigid San Francisco, where it's 69.
Oh, poor thing. I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Before we get going, I want to make a quick announcement, and then we'll announce our guest. I'm putting together a Kickstarter campaign kind of to help support the shows that we do at devchat.tv. In particular, though, it's a video series, a screencast series, on how to do stuff in Ruby on Rails, which may or may not be relevant to this show, depending on what you use on the back end for your Angular app. But regardless, if you want to go support the show, there are support levels for all different types of people. Some of them include some of my time for coaching or in-person training. So if you want to go check it out, you can go to devchat.tv/Kickstarter and just check it out, and I really appreciate the support. This week, we're going to be talking about the Angular UI router, and we have a special guest to talk to us about that. That's Craig McKeachie.
Hi, everyone.
Craig, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. I'm probably best known for writing the JavaScript Framework Guide, a book that covers, Angular, Ember, and Backbone and kind of compares and contrasts them and helps you kind of learn them at once. But I also do Angular training, and so I'm here. I'm glad to be here.
That's cool. And you're here to talk to us about routing. How did you get into that?
So that's a pretty open-ended question. Sorry, you threw me a little bit there, Ward.
I
does that.
I didn't want to ask you true, false questions. Craig, do you think routing is a really bad idea, true or false?
No, I listened to the show, and I heard on a past episode, I forget which one it was, but you guys had mentioned, hey, the UI router in particular and routing in Angular deserves its own show. So, I reached out to Chuck because I've been on a couple of the other podcasts and said, I recently wrote a blog post on this. I had trouble kind of wrapping my head around, particularly the UI router, but I'm, kind of a big fan now. And so, I just said, hey, why don't I come on and we talk about it?
Hey Craig, the questions only get harder from here, right? What is your name?
What is your quest? Oh, sorry, wrong show.
So I'm curious too on this because, I know that you're famous for your book, and I think that's awesome, the way you compared all those frameworks. But how do you feel about the routing situation as SPA? I mean, I think some people don't understand when they come into it that a router is almost an essential piece of it. You can build a SPA without one, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the examples, particularly, with Angular, because it's really easy to show the data binding example without even, creating a controller or a router or anything. And people sometimes, that's the easy thing to demo, so they tend to show that. But, really when you're building an app, you probably want to think about your routes first, or at least, the virtual pages or views you have that you're going to transition in and out of. So I definitely think it's important.
So tell me, what do you think are the sort of essential characteristics of a router?
Well, I think that I've seen sort of two generations of routers out there. So the first generation is where I would see some of the essential characteristics. So at its base level there, it's here's a URL, map me, to a block of code that needs to run when I go to this URL. And usually, with a single page application, that URL mapping to code, that code does something like instantiates a controller and marries it up to a view or a template and renders that into the UI. So, I see that as the basic functionality, the ability to, when you go to a given URL to sort of handle that transition between what I like to think of as virtual views. You've got your single page, but you're actually transitioning in different templates into the view to give sort of a virtual page loading experience to the user.
So it's some kind of marrying of the URL to navigation, where navigation leads to dynamic view composition. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So let me throw a hard one at you. why the emphasis on the URL? I mean, I get it for a web page because there's really no other way to get around a browser. But if you think about desktop apps, they don't even have a notion of a URL. If you look at mobile applications on our phone, they don't have a URL, yet all of them have navigation. So why is, and if we had a banking app, right? If I had a banking app, it's not like I want to have somebody have a deep link into my checking account. So what do you think about that question of why is the URL so central to this notion?
I think it is important. And yes, there are instances where the URL is less important, or particularly, as you kind of drill down into different states or different levels in your application, it may be overkill for you to have every single sort of transition in state in your application to be a URL. So, you can take it too far. But I think it's important. For example, the exact example you gave, I wouldn't want to link directly to an account in my bank, and I would argue, well, maybe you would. Like, I think that would be a very useful thing to get an email that says, hey, it seems that you had an overdraw on this account. And there's a link in the email to that account. Now, of course, when you hit that URL, you would want to authenticate the person first and then redirect them to that page. It's still behind, a login, but how are you going to send that email to someone and get them to the right place? You just want to always have them log into the app and then hunt and peck their way around to find something? I think I would argue not.
Well, I think that the things that are changing in routing recently have been, it used to be just, deep linking in history, but now it's becoming more about composing the app, I think. So not just having a route go from an address in the URL in the browser and linking it up, but also having different parts of the page, areas, if you will, or zones, which can then be composed based upon routes and subroutes or states if using UI router. But by the way, I wanted to mention that I think what you just designed, Craig, was a phishing scam for bank accounts. So that's all I could think about when you said that.
That's an excellent point. But I think there are lots of times when you want to deep link into an app and make it convenient. Maybe the banking app, I was being hung out there to dry by Ward. Thanks, Ward, by the way. But
I agree. I think he set you up on that one. But
but you know what? I thought your comeback was really terrific because I'm sitting here saying to myself, you know what? That's a good idea. Like, why should I go find, like, if there's a problem with a particular deposit, why should I have to work my way through the history if you can tell me? And you got me on my heels there on that one. So, because I thought, aha, I got him. Nobody would want that, but maybe you got a point. It's just that coming from the desktop or, in a world where there are no URLs, you question this. And I had a client who refused to use controllers or the router precisely because they wanted nothing to do with the idea that somebody could link in. They wanted them to march their way through the user experience to get there. And they still wanted dynamically composed views and navigation, but they didn't want the URL to participate in it. And there seems no way in today's routers to be able to say, I want to be able to do application navigation independent of URL change. It just doesn't seem to be an option. And I guess it's the lack of that option that's got me on my heels.
Yeah, and I think, but I kind of liked the way John was taking us there with the composability story, because I think there is that sort of second evolution. I think we could talk about the whole the URL thing. Is it important or isn't it important? For a while, but I think, reasonable people would agree and disagree on that. But I feel like it's a more important point the way routers are evolving to this more of a composability story. But I'll leave it up to the floor as to where we head next here.
Yeah, well, if you hate your users, then definitely leave the URL out. No, I really, though, I think we kind of trained ourselves over the last, 20 years, 30 years of having the internet that the URL kind of is the way of accessing a resource. And so I like the idea of coming in on a single page app and being able to easily get where I want to go. And to that degree, then maybe I don't need the URL to update. But I really feel like, and this is the point that Craig made, but like if I'm dealing with a particular instance of something, then definitely I want to have a resource listing that I can go and hit and work on. If it's a complicated workflow, you also want them just so that people don't have to waste a bunch of time getting to where they need to be.
I hear you, but there's no such corollary within native mobile applications. And as a matter of fact, in many of the design languages, they won't even let you do it. You gotta go the way they say. I know that was originally true in the Windows design language. It was very constraining, and I thought that was true on Windows Phone. But I think it was true across the native mobile apps, where there's no notion of a URL. You navigate according to the way they tell you to.
That's true.
So I think routing's an interesting point too, in this Bob, because if you look at it, it solves a problem that you can solve, as Craig alluded to earlier, using ng include, custom directives, or your own custom composability techniques. So why, I guess it goes back to you, Craig, when do you tell somebody to use UI router as opposed to doing a custom directive or an include or maybe an ng switch even?
Well, the short answer is all the time. No, just kidding. But, honestly, like business reasons would be, there's two that I outlined in the post that I think, after reading a lot of stuff, and the one actually comes from, an argument that the Ember framework uses, sort of to compete against the Angular framework. And that is the ideal nested routes. So the idea of a nested route, as, when I, interviewed Tom Dale, who's, one of the creators of Ember for my podcast, he basically was the first person who kind of made me aware of this idea that you have a list. Let's say it's a list of blog posts, and you click on a blog post in the list. And then you want to show the detail of the blog post, the content of the blog post, but you want to keep the list on the page. And that's the idea. So you have the list, say, on the left-hand side of the page. When you click an item, you see the detail on the right-hand side. And you can even take this one step further, as they do in Ember's classic blog example, is then you might want to edit that detail. So you might have an edit link, in the detail. You click edit and a form appears. And it might be reasonable for you want to deep link into any of those states and have all that to basically have the list and have the detail on the page at the exact same time. And so that's that concept of nested views. So people don't get confused. In Angular 2.0, this is referred to as child routes. So you'll hear nested views, you'll hear child routes. I believe there's one other term I've heard before, but most commonly, nested is the term people use for this idea. Master detail is what we might know it as from, our older application building paradigms.
So that's a great point, nested routes. Now, when I first looked at nested routes, one of the things I found is when I started explaining it to people, they were confused in some cases. Maybe it was just me explaining it, very likely. But think about a nested route. What we're not saying is that when you go down a nested route like customer detail, a customer list, or whatever else it might be, you're not going to have different URLs for every route showing up at the same time. Meaning you could have 4 routes, different states on the screen with an Angular app, with nested routes and other routes, but only one of them is actually married to the address bar. And I think sometimes that can be confusing for people. What's happening here? How can you possibly have 2 routes at the same time? How do you explain that to people in a clear way?
That's a good question. And I think it's easy to think about for me when I have a concrete example like the one I just gave, where you want 2 elements to show on the page. Now, granted, you could achieve that example I just said, the list detail example, by simply hiding and showing the detail on the page using like an ng class or something. But I feel like that's not very elegant because, as I show in examples when I'm training and so forth, is that the great thing about using a nested route for that scenario is that you can break the code for the list and the code for the detail. Each have their own controllers, their own views or templates, and it's sort of encapsulated or isolated separately. So I feel like that's the big win, is when you can have that composability story and you can pull those back apart and have like a list just on the page. And then when you click on an item, it goes to a detail page that's just got the detail, or you can bring them together and, only takes a few lines of code because you've constructed it in a composable way. Although, John, I'm not sure I really answered your question there. So maybe somebody else can give a try on that too.
Well, I think what you did is you kind of answered it the same way I did, which is it's not an easy thing to describe. It might be better visual representation. When you're showing different zones on the screen with different routes all rendering. Because every time I've explained it just verbally, I think it gets confusing to think, well, how can you have 4 things that all point to the same address bar?
Yeah, and I guess one kind of way to think about it is you're building onto the URL. So you start with the URL might just say /list, and then it might say /list/detail with an ID on the end, eventually. So you're kind of nesting down, if you think of the URL as it gets longer as being nested inside of the prior sort of level of the URL, then, you're creating this, more of a composable, you're composing the URL at the same time as you're composing the screen. And the advantage of that is simply that you can either deep link to any of those states, or you can also, the back button won't break at any of those states. If somebody hits the back button and expects to go, they go to list, they go to detail, they hit the back button, they expect to go back to the list. That will work with this sort of nested route example, and likely won't work if you're just hiding and showing things.
So I'm still struggling with this myself. So let me try this on you. See, is this true? Because I had the same problem that everybody else has with this. Like, how can I have a single URL represent, like, say, 3 things? So the way I've sort of come to it is I think of it as each of the segments of the URL represents a state in the hierarchy, right? Like, so let's take your thing. It goes blah, blah, blah list. All right. So let's suppose blah, blah, blah is the outer one. And then there's list, which is so I have an outer state that's the blah, 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 right? Is that fair? Like an outer box?
Sounds good.
And then I go list, and you say, okay, so that's a box inside the list area inside my blah, blah, blah box. So I've got a box and a box. And then you go /detail1, and that's a box inside that box. Can I see it as sort of boxes and boxes and boxes? Is that fair?
I like that analogy.
Okay, so then if each box is responsible for itself, I guess I can understand that the blah, blah, blah describes the state of the outer box and it maintains that state. And then as soon as I went inside, I didn't actually have to lose that outer box, right? In other words, it's that all that apparatus and all that state that represents the outer shell there is still operative. It didn't go away. I simply added new stuff that went into that inner box. Is that true?
Correct. So you're composing, right? You're just adding to that inner box. And I think when you talk about the boxes, that's a nice transition into the other advantage of using something like UI Router, which is with the built-in router in Angular. I say built-in, but it's in the Angular project now, but it's been pulled out as a separate download, basically. So like ng-animate or resource or something like that. So you have to include an extra script file. But to get to the point, there's a tag that you put on the page that basically, or directive in Angular terminology, that says, here's where I want you to place that new view, that virtual page, or that new page that you're loading into my single page. And that tag is called ng-view within the ng router. There is a limitation with that router. The new one that Angular is coming out with does not have this limitation that there only can be one ng-view directive on a page. So this is where, obviously, then you can't nest views. You can't put an ng-view with another ng-view nested inside of it. And furthermore, the other advantage of it is, it's very common to have sort of a header on a page and a footer and a main content area and maybe a sidebar or two. And each of these areas, ideally, at least for me, I'd like that code sort of encapsulated in its own controller and own view template and so forth. But since you can't have what I call multiple views on the page, that's the other thing that Angular UI Router allows. So nested views and multiple views. So the multiple views I like to think of as, having a home header sort of view and then a footer view and a sidebar view and a content view. If you think of a page being split up into boxes as you to carry your analogy on. So you can either nest those boxes, but you don't need to nest those boxes. But the draw of the UI router is that you can't have more than one box on the screen at a time. And
you can let the router define what those things are that are going to be on there. Because if I didn't have that, right, if I didn't have that feature that you're describing, then the outer controller would have to place those things in all by its lonesome.
Or,
right?
Sometimes what you end up with, if you didn't have that, is you end up with maybe a template it has many responsibilities. If you think of, a template that has a single responsibility or a view that has just a single job, you end up with these views that are doing multiple things like, controlling the navigation as well as still rendering the content on the page and so forth.
Right. We did it with ng includes, right? We would just say ng include header, ng include footer, and then we would reserve the one area in the middle for the dynamically controlled view. And it could get complicated. Yeah.
Right. And the ng include would work, but that code that if you do anything dynamic in that header, right, the navigation, let's say, is in the header, If you do anything dynamic there, like trying to keep the active state, which tab is active or which item in the nav is active, that code tends to, there are ways around this, but it tends to get repeated in your controllers or throughout your application. Whereas if you have that kind of just code that runs and its only job is to maintain that navigation, that's kind of nice to have that isolation.
So I was a little bit confused about why you would use this, but I'm kind of getting the picture now, and I want to just make sure that I understand. So for the most part, I think people generally just, use whatever workflow you hand them. So if you're doing like blog posts and you have a list of the blog posts on the side, people are just going to go with it because that's where they wind up. And so where this really works out is if you have a complicated layout that has multiple areas that can all be updated in different ways. And so people can navigate to more of a complex set of views or subviews inside of the main view, then this can get them back to exactly where they were because it tells in the route, then it tells it where all of the different views were when they left. Does that make sense?
I think that's a good summary, yeah.
Yeah. Let me see if I've got the same insight you have, Chuck, or maybe it's just the thing that stood out for me about the difference between the regular one and this one. I mean, the regular one, you only get one. So if you're going to have any complex structure, you get one place to make the change. And every time you change the URL, it's got to recompose everything all the way down, and it loses all the state all the way down from wherever you start. I think that's true of the Angular Zone router. But as I understand it, tell me if I'm right, Craig, with the UI router, let's suppose I'm just changing the URL to change some one small box deep down, right? Deep down in that nested structure. I can do that without having to reconstruct all the outer pieces, all the outer containers, and have them rebuild all their state and all that other stuff. All that, I don't have to do that. All that stays just there. And so that move to that deep down inner URL that's dealing with some small part of the real estate on my screen, it only has to change that state. Everything else is going to stay there for me. Is that fair?
You're causing me to think pretty hard about whether, that other code that's the beginning of the URL reruns. And I think it kind of has to do with how you coded it. But my gut is telling me, from what I understand, is that code still reruns. It's more about, did you keep track of where you went? Did you leave the breadcrumbs behind you so that you can get back on the trail where you came from? So it's not about performance as much or, not rerunning code. It's about code maintenance and code being in the, isolated and in a place where it makes sense. And then it's also about keeping a trail through the actions that you took so that you can make it back to any specific state, any specific path you took on your journey to get where you are in the app.
Well, let's put a pin in that because I could swear that was true. For example, take your list detail, right? And you have the list on the left-hand side, and every time you click a detail, that's a new drawing of the detail area on your screen, right? In your master detail. Mm-hmm. And I could swear, because the list is in the outer one, right? It's in the outer part, the higher level state, and then the detail one is the next one down and inside. I could swear it wouldn't cause me to redraft the list and repopulate the lists. That because that was in the outer state, I could count on that still being there untouched and all
I see. The detail. I think it's nuances here. We might be saying the same thing. So if it's just about the data, right? Do you have to go back out and get the data again? The answer is no, you don't have to go back out and get the data again, right? You could just share that with the child controller. There's ways to do that. But if it's more about, does that controller that builds up the outer view when you go to that new state, does it get reinstantiated? That's where I think, maybe the template gets re-rendered and the controller gets reinstantiated as you transition deeper and deeper down into the URL. Does that make sense?
It does, but I have a different recollection, so we're going to put a pin in that and come back.
Okay. Yeah, I'm obviously not sure of this. But yeah, I think the important point is, I see the benefit as being, the composability story, regardless of under the hood, whether there's, some performance impact. Right. I think it would be a minor one. I guess you could argue there were scenarios where that wouldn't be the case, but I think the important point is you have one ng view per page when you're looking at you're using the built-in router in 1.2 or 1.3 of Angular. Well, I can't say, just to be clear here, the Angular team would probably be remiss if I didn't say, we'll probably get to this, but the Angular team has a new router. They built it for the 2.0 of the framework. They're backporting it into 1.3 of the framework, or perhaps 1.4 now, because I think they may have moved to 1.4. But they're basically, backporting it into the latest 1.x branch. And it's maybe there already, but a lot of people are still, because of browser, support issues, are still stuck on the 1.2. So that's kind of where I'd say, use the Angular. If you're stuck on 1.2 of the framework because you need to support IE8, use the Angular UI router. That is your best option. When you get to, 1.3 and 1.4, I would look to use the Angular router because they added these capabilities to their router. They rewrote the router basically, and they added the capability to do nested routes and multiple views. They call them child routes, and I'm not sure what the terminology is. I can't remember for the multiple views, but it is there. So if you're able to use, the most recent version of the framework, it is rapidly getting there. I'm supposed to take a look at it and just haven't had time to see if it's, actually been finished porting. So just to be clear, it is there and it is fixed. So this is really just about people who are in the 1.2 world.
Right.
So hey, I'd like to ask a question about like other routers, and then if you have any thoughts specifically about the new router for 1.4. So like routers and other frameworks, good and bad about them, good innovations, any thoughts there? And then also talk more about the 1.4 router and the backported from 2.0 and what you think of that.
Right. So I think that other frameworks that clearly had an impact on this router being improved in Angular in the 1.4 version are Ember, obviously, and Durandal. Durandal, that most people don't know as well, but this is Rob Eisenberg. So the story goes, to catch people up. My understanding, he wrote the Durandal framework. It had a nice, robust router similar to Ember's. Not sure which came first there, but they both had, basically another generation ahead of router that supported nested routes and multiple nested views and multiple views in it. He wrote that, then he joined the Angular team for a period of months and worked with the Angular team on the 2.0 version of the framework. And I believe one of his big responsibilities was to work on the router. He's at least, been the public face at conferences and so forth for the new router. And it has, this idea of an app router and child routes. So it's clearly, in the same vein. As far as what I think of the router in 1.4, I have to apologetically say that the Angular team has been, proactive and reached out to me and said, hey, check it out, let us know what you think, and I've been trying to find the time to take the example in my book and port it over to that, but I haven't had the time, so I have no reason to speak. The only thing I have done is looked at, Rob Eisenberg's presentations on the router and the functionality it'll have, and it's clear that, it is these things we're talking about, that these nested views and multiple views. Nested views, again, are called child views in this new router. Is that kind of what you were looking to understand?
Yeah, well enough.
Yeah, I was a little bit curious about the Ember one, but the thing that you haven't mentioned, maybe John was about to say this, because John and I fought this like mad. In all the routers we had seen, there didn't seem to be any support for page lifecycle. John, was that where you were going to go?
Yeah, that's something I really loved that Rob put into one of his early routers. And when we were working with, let's go back in time now, a couple of years ago, to using SAMI and History.js and all that, that was the first thing we were looking for to add into it was, how do I know how I can tap into before the route activates, after the route activates, and then in the controller that it actually gets activated and hooked to, when that controller is activated, when it's about to be activated, like a pre-check. And then Rob also added into Durandal and Aurelia different things like having a pre-deactivate and then a deactivated hook.
And why would you use that, John? Why is that important, John?
Well, the first thing we hit, again, going back in time when we actually had hair on our heads, at least for me, a couple of years ago, to having these controllers where I want to check to see some state on the page. So let's say I'm on a customer details page and I'm editing something and somebody routes off of it. How do I check to make sure, okay, before you go off of here, I want to check with the controller on that page to make sure it's okay before I leave. And the event structure that's in the Angular basic router, it doesn't cut it. You need to have the controller have control over that, pun intended. So it can say, look, before you leave here, do this check, and then set a flag to say, yes, you can, or no, you can't. And this was really, really important when we were doing like dirty checking on pages. Because you can't.
It's an async check, right, John? I mean, in other words, it's not something I can simply check and then go. It's like I have to wait for the user or something else to confirm that it's okay to go, right?
Which is why it's got to support promises and all that. It's one of the reasons that you and I call the the main functions inside the controller, activate and deactivate.
And there was no obvious way to do that in NG Router. There's no obvious way, maybe Craig knows, how to do that effectively within the UI router. And I was wondering if Ember even has that notion. Do you happen to know, Craig?
I'm not positive of this answer, but I know clearly Rob Eisenberg wrote the majority of the router in the new version of Angular in the 1.4 branch and in the 2.0 branch. And it has this similar feature, right? It was inspired by his past work, right? It was something I've heard him say on several podcasts is that he felt was really, needed for the same reasons you guys just outlined. As far as the UI router, it has events, but the events to me feel very similar to the same kind of events that you get, fired in the NG route.
Right.
But that specific scenario you guys are talking about, I'm not sure if it has, maybe one more event at the right point in the life cycle that allows you to sort of cancel
I think
out
the
of that
routes
view
on
transition.
Yeah, and I think the event's in the wrong place is kind of what Ward and I fell into is, well, it's cool to have an event on the router saying, yeah, you're about to go somewhere. The logic that has to run to determine that isn't usually associated with the router. So, for example, the two problems I have with it, and I'm kind of on a soapbox here and I apologize, but in the controller, that's where I need to know if I should leave the page or not in the router itself. So that check, like Ward's saying, you want to put up to a user and say, hey, you've got some dirty changes here. Would you like to save them, cancel them, stay in the page, go somewhere else, have a drink? That has to happen in the controller. It's not a router event. And then the second piece of that is they've built in these things called resolvers or resolves, the promises into both UI router and the Angular router. And that's great for those, but now we're taking logic that normally would live in a controller. We're saying, hey, the data that we want to actually add to the controller, let's have the router handle getting that and injecting it in the controller. And to me, that you're separating out logic on who's doing what now, which separation is generally good, but shouldn't the controller know what it needs and tell the service to go get it?
It's upside down. Why would the router know what the controller is supposed to know? And so
the router should just know
head.
that this guy belongs to that. The router's a marriage counselor. It says you belong with that person. Yeah. Go in peace.
Marriage counselor. I like that.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, John. And so this router first notion, which is written right through Ember, it's one of the things about Ember I don't understand, and maybe Craig, you can do it, but they see the world, as I understand it, they see the world from the router down, and I always thought of the router as as something helpful, but not central to my application design. So maybe there's something wrong with me. Help me come to terms with that.
I feel like it's just back to that conversation we had earlier. Do you buy into that notion? And I think there's a large subset of apps that are on an intranet inside an enterprise. Maybe they don't have requirements that need you to deep link to things. I still find that a lot of the apps I've built, it would be very useful to have people deep link into things. They send emails. They want the back button to work. I mean, it's like the obvious thing to me.
You sold me on that part. That I think that's a different question, though, as to where the decision logic needs to be to determine whether you can activate or deactivate and that kind of stuff.
Right. The issue here isn't so much like, do you buy into URL deep linking, but more like, is the router really just almost like a higher level controller, or is it, as John said, a marriage counselor?
Right. That's interesting that you guys really feel. To me, maybe it's just because I see it and I accept it for what it is, and I haven't run into the specific issue. I'm curious, were you able? Because to me, you're in the controller, right? And you say scope.on, and you wire up the event. You inject, whatever state provider. Let's say we're using Angular UI router. You inject the state provider. Are you able to actually achieve what you needed, but you just feel like the code is in the wrong place on the API? Or did you guys hit a roadblock where it was like, I can't achieve this, I can't cancel this transition?
Well, the canceling the transitions definitely is an issue. The situation that Ward and I mentioned about the deactivate and the activate and the can deactivate and the can activate, those are methods that Rob put in the Durandal router and is getting into the new Angular one. Okay. Those things are actually issues you cannot solve well in the UI router or the Angular router today. And in fact, that's what caused me to write a big ranting email to Brad Green and Igor about 2 years ago. And
we couldn't solve them at all, John. We couldn't do it at all.
Could not be solved.
We could not implement that. We had to, and just to, so that's why everybody, the only hook you had was the resolve, because that's the only asynchronous hook in the entire routing scheme, and that's too late.
Yeah, and we wrote, so we can't solve it all. It couldn't be solved with the framework. We actually wrote probably about 700 lines of code to get around it, to make it work. And that's when we said, forget this. Let's ask them to talk to Rob, because Rob has solved this, and see where it goes. And obviously good things came of it. But that's when we started switching the route up and doing other things. And in some cases use resolvers, which is really kind of a hack around that, in my opinion. Or you can also do things like we did with local storage with Whip Ward.
Yeah.
So we save the data off on the controller to local storage, and then when you leave, you don't have to ask the user, hey, do you want to save the changes? Because
exactly.
we're doing it for them.
Right. We said, hey, we can't solve the problem, so we're not going to ask you, but we'll make it so it's not painful if you made a bad decision and left.
Right. And just to be clear, this is all with NG route, right? And which version of the framework? And where do things stand now?
Or NG router. It's with both the routers that exist in Angular today.
Okay. Yep. And you were like 1.2 of the framework, or 1.1, and probably you'd think we're still.
It was 1.2,
fighting.
but none of this has changed in 1.3. The new router will address some of these things, though. The one that Rob wrote, and I think Brian Ford maybe is taking over.
Brian Ford worked on it, and they've made it asynchronous throughout. They've made it promise-based throughout, and that is so big. The fact that the routers are now promise-based is so big. And so I was curious about what Ember is going to do, or has, in the way of a page lifecycle. I mean, nested router, the nested stuff, that is a huge improvement of the UI router over the NG router. The ability to define multiple views for a particular state, that's fantastic. I think that there's a clear win there. But this asynchronous page lifecycle control stuff, that's been missing over here, and I wonder whether Ember has it, and I'm kind of curious, Craig, that it has, whether you felt this urgent need that John and I apparently have.
I haven't, but honestly, I haven't, had that specific requirement, although it seems like a very reasonable one that almost everyone would have, but I just haven't run into that specific issue. But I do get what you're saying, and it seems really real. From the Ember side, I'm fairly certain they do have something like this, but it's sort of easy. We're kind of in the weeds here at in a very specific use case. So I don't want to say absolutely, but I'm fairly certain, they're kind of big on the lifecycle thing. Let's put it that way, right? A lot of their objects, right?
Well, I think a lot of frameworks have had life cycles. .NET, Java, all these different frameworks out there have had these life cycles in their frameworks for years. And what I liked about what the Durandal lifecycle did and the new Angular one is there's like a convention that you can follow. So if you just name a function activate or can deactivate inside of your controller, those things just get invoked at the right time in the right place, and then they have promises hooked into them so you can tell it to do things. And once you start using that, you start realizing how much code you no longer have to write to make those things happen. And I think that's the beauty of it, and that's why I'm really excited about where they're heading with it.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. I mean, if you want a backing of like, why is this important? You can say, well, Angular's obviously found it important enough to build into the newer versions of the framework. This is clearly an evolution. Maybe you don't need these features in the specific app you're building, but probably eventually you're going to be happy that you're using something that allows you this kind of flexibility.
Craig, they talk about state in the UI router. What do you, and that's sort of a state-based thing. What does the state object mean to you within that context? Does it have any particular value? How, as opposed to a route, right? In other words, the UI router talks about a state object and you talk to a state object, whereas in NG router, you talk about a route. Is that just a difference in terminology, or do you think there's substance there?
It does map pretty cleanly across, but, one nuance that, is not obvious is think about what if you wanted to change all the routes in your app, like you decided that you didn't like your routing structure. The way that, the state provider API works, if you look at it closely, the URL is just a property of a configuration property. And everywhere else in your app, you refer to your routes as states, sort of by this, state name that you give it. So at any point, you could totally redo your URL structure. Don't ask me how much value that has, but it can in certain circumstances. So it's kind of like this, argument with in the data access days where you could totally switch out your SQL Server backend for your Oracle backend. When it happens, you're really glad there's that abstraction there. Probably doesn't happen that often, but I think that's one major argument for having that abstraction, is that basically you're using these names everywhere in your application instead of using the actual URLs, which has some value, I believe.
I agree. Yeah, I feel that too.
The flip side of that coin is, the abstraction of a state provider. So just to elaborate a little bit, backtrack, the UI router has this state machine abstraction on top of routes. So instead of dealing with routes, you're dealing with states in your application. And the states, basically, that works for most use cases. But when you need like a catch-all route, let's say, for like a 404 page or to redirect to the login page, there's still another object called the URL router provider that is needed to do redirects and to do those catch-all routes. So they basically still have this sort of lower level router concept. It's just that you build most of your app, using the state provider.
All right. I hate to do it, but we gotta start wrapping up.
Oh, too bad, because I just the other thing that drove me crazy was the whole provide thing. It wasn't dynamic construction of routes. You had to do it all during the config phase. That stuff drives me nuts.
But we figured out how to get around that too.
Oh, you did, but it's totally like, why did I have to figure out how to get around that? Why are they so locked in when the app starts and that, those are the routes forever and how,
that'll be our cliffhanger for another episode.
Exactly. Oh, well, go ahead, Chuck.
All right.
Get us back on track.
I know. Sorry. All right. John, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, so my first picks are actually 3. This seems like it's the year of the Angular events, and right now we've got ngConf just around the corner. As Joe and you have been let everybody know, that's going to be wicked awesome, and it's got the whole Angular team keynoting and doing a bunch of great stuff. And then there's also 2 new events that I've learned about recently. One of them is Angular U. It's in June, out in San Francisco, Ward Bell's neck of the woods, unfortunately. So I imagine he's going to be there.
Or is that Angular U?
Angular U. It's an Italian conference for Angular.
Hey,
no.
you.
And then the third one is
forget about it.
I think just 2 or 3 days ago, it was NG Vegas was announced as well by our own Joe Eames. So we've got quite a bit of a year coming along with Angular, and some people have been saying, it's on it's already peaked. I think there's a lot more coming.
All right. Joe, do you want to do some picks?
I will definitely pick NG Vegas since I announced it and I'm helping organize it. I do want to make something clear. NG Vegas is not ngConf. It is not a subsidiary of ngConf, but a couple of friendly associations is pretty much it. So if anybody's confused about that, do not ask any questions to ngConf about NG Vegas. They are separate, completely unrelated events. So I'd like to pick that. I also want to pick the book Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I've been on a Brandon Sanderson kick for just a long time now, just consuming and reading everything I possibly can. And been reading Way of Kings, really enjoying it. But I also found just his shorter novellas are super awesome. I've never been a fan of short stories, and they're longer than short stories. They're 30-ish pages around. But man, they are just so well written. I never thought that I would enjoy something that short, but he's written like 5 or 6 of them. I've enjoyed every one that I've read. So that'll be my real pick, is Brandon Sanderson's novellas and Way of Kings.
Awesome. Ward, do you have some picks for us?
I do. First, I'll mention Craig's little post on the AngularJS UI router, and that's sort of the background for the discussion we had today. And we'll put that link in the show notes. The other thing is I tripped over Ira Glass. Do you know Ira Glass, This American Life, the NPR
Great
thing?
show.
Great show. And there were a series of interviews with him about how he sees storytelling and what they don't teach you in school about how to write. And so I'll put some links into that, but it's fascinating, and I'm trying to incorporate it into how I present. We'll see what kind of disaster that brings, but it's really brilliant, unexpected. And of course, it's delivered in his very easily receptive style. So I'm going to put that in there and have you all listen to Ira Glass.
All right. I've got a couple of picks. These are all my stuff, but it's stuff that I'm working on. First off, as I said before, I'm doing the Kickstarter campaign. If you zoned out for that, it's at the beginning of the show. But it's a great way to support the shows. And ultimately, the goal is to make it so I don't have to spend as much time consulting, and I can spend more time doing the podcast stuff. So The second pick that I have is devboxclub.com. And right now I'm just collecting email addresses and talking to vendors of various things that are of interest to programmers, and everything from, stuff you put on your desk to books and t-shirts and stuff like that. And the idea is that you get a box full of interesting stuff every month. And so it's a subscription service, but I'm working out the details, and I'm interested to see how many people are interested in it before I go and pull the trigger on it. The last one that I'm going to pick, and this is, again, Ruby related, but I'm going to put it out there, and then if people don't care about it, then don't click it. But it's Ruby Remote Conf. So last week we had JS Remote Conf, and it was a huge success. Everybody seemed pretty happy with it. So if you're into Ruby, then go check out rubyremoteconf.com. Craig, do you have some picks for us?
I do. Despite earlier on the call when we first hooked up, I was complaining about the amount of snow I have here in Columbus, Ohio. But last week I was at Disney World in Orlando. One thing I found that was sort of surprising, I'd been there several times to the Magic Kingdom, and there's a scavenger hunt that's a lot of people don't know about, like a pirate's adventure, Pirates of the Caribbean area, that's totally free and basically, is really quite elaborate. My kids absolutely loved it. We went there 2 days to the Magic Kingdom and didn't have as much stuff to ride the second day. And it was a very big surprise at how much fun it was and how elaborate it was. Another pick is Sean Fiorito, who's another self-published author. He does an Angular course, but he wrote this, he calls it the Ginormous Unstoppable Angular Resource List. And I give away like a resource list for each of the frameworks as part of my book. And this has a lot of the same stuff I have on there, except it's absolutely free. It's out there. So I wanted to make people aware of that. I think it's, a great exhaustive list of Angular resources, one of the better ones I've seen. And yeah, so those are my picks.
All right. Joe, you have an announcement for us about NGConf and us?
Sure. And all of us. At NGConf on Friday, that would be the 6th of March, we will be recording a live podcast episode for Adventures in Angular. That'll happen at about 12 o'clock Mountain Time, give or take a few minutes. It will be live streamed on the live stream, so if you want to tune in at that moment and watch, you can actually see all of our faces in action.
Oh my.
Right. They're going to unshackle us, drag us out of the dungeon, and let you all see us.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a selling point. I really don't. But we will be live. It will be unedited. You get to hear all of the ums and all of the horrible names that we call each other that get edited out from the regular shows. You'll get to see it all. The fist fighting, it'll be there.
Oh, excellent.
And we'll be talking about NGConf and our impressions, which is why we're doing it on day 2 to have as much of the conference behind us. And that'll be the episode on Friday the 6th. So you can watch it live. And of course, it'll be posted to the regular list of podcasts, audio only later on. But you can watch it live, and it'll also be on YouTube. It'll be posted to YouTube shortly after.
That'll be the 50 Shades of Joe episode, right?
Oh, let's please steer clear of that. That's something we're going to have edited out. You will be able to see live that normally gets edited out.
I don't know if we want to see anything associated with that, Joe. Sorry.
Oh, but the vision I have of Joe in leather is just scaring me.
Oh, man. Ward, you're killing me. I'm going to bring
this is from a man. This is from a man like Ward who knows a lot about wearing leather.
That's right. I'm going to bring everybody one of those masquerade masks, and we'll do it.
Isn't that Eyes Wide Shut?
I don't know. I'm not really up on
Chuck, you better leave
Charles,
this in.
Okay, I think I need to end. I just got back from throwing up. I think we need to end it still. All right. Well, thanks for coming, Craig.
Yeah, it's great to be on and talk with you guys. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, we'll catch everybody next week. This episode is sponsored by Mad Glory. You've been building software for a long time, and sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. Work piles up, hiring sucks, and it's hard to get projects out the door. Check out Mad Glory. They're a small shop with experience shipping big products. They're smart, dedicated, will augment your team, and work as hard as you do. Find them online at madglory.com or on Twitter at madglory. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more. Do you want to have conversations with the Adventures in Angular crew and their guests? Do you want to support the show? Now you can. Go to adventuresinangular.com/forum and sign up today.